This is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at Kyo-no-oto Urahairo. I'll do a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll take a look at a writing sample that I did earlier on 20-pound copy paper. I'll compare Kyo-no-oto Urahairo to some similar inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of the water resistance test. I didn't enjoy writing with Urahairo using a glass dip pen. It just felt too dry, but it does look nice. When I did my swatch using tweezers, the ink didn't want to grab the paper. In fact, I had to kind of scribble it around right here to get it to actually grab it and complete the swatch. The drip at the end of the swatch shows that there won't be any sheen with this ink, but there is a nice looking halo of darker ink, and you see that very subtly in the writing with the glass dip pen. I'll begin with a Pilot 78G. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. This extra fine nib is just not well suited for a pale ink like this. I feel like I have to press harder to make the ink more legible, though pressing harder doesn't really make it more legible. But I just have that feeling as I'm writing with this ink, and that just makes it more scratchy on the page. I wouldn't call this scratchy, but it's just, it feels dry. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom Heritage 91. It has a 14 karat fine nib. This 14 karat nib, it also feels dry. It feels much better than the extra fine, but it still feels dry. But it doesn't feel scratchy. It just feels, it feels like you're writing with rubber and there's just more friction on the paper. It's an odd sensation, but it's kind of unpleasant. It doesn't look like it's very dry. There's quite a bit of ink there, but I guess because this ink, I guess, has a low viscosity, it feels dry. I don't even know what to put for this one. I'm just going to put a sad face. I just don't like it. Next, I've got a Platinum 3776. It has a 14 karat medium nib. Again, this ink and nib combination just feels dry. This nib, this platinum medium nib, typically performs pretty well with these kind of low saturation inks, but this ink is just so pale. I feel like my pen is on the verge of running out of ink. It's just, again, it's not a very pleasant experience. I'm just going to put another sad face on this one. Next, I've got a Pilot Grants. It also has a 14 karat medium nib. This is much wetter and I've got much more ink going down on the page, so I can write with a lighter hand and it feels smoother. So this is much more pleasant than the previous nibs. I'll go ahead and give that one a happy face. Next, I've got a Pilot Metropolitan. It has a stainless steel calligraphy medium nib. I'm not crazy about the way this ink looks in this dry stub nib. It's just very pale. The legibility's not great. Again, it kind of feels like my swatch that I did with the tweezers. I have a little trouble getting the ink to grab the paper. You have to write with a heavier hand, and even when you do so, the darkness of the ink, it's still pretty pale. And so this again, on each writing sample that I did, I dreaded writing with this pen. It's just not enjoyable. Next, I've got a Kaweco AL Sport. It's the Golden Espresso edition. It has a stainless steel broad nib. The Kaweco broad nib is nice, and it's still very pale, but I like the legibility of it. It's a pretty pale green ink, so I'm going to say this is nice. It's nice and smooth. It doesn't feel dry on this nib. This nib is just glassy smooth, and I hope you could see that. Boy, that was almost off camera. This nib makes this ink usable. One of the things I wanted to mention real quick is my Golden Espresso printing on my Golden Espresso pen started out as a nice gold color, but now it's almost the same color as the pen. I don't know what happened. I'm not sad about this color change that has happened. I would have been okay with just the engraving on the pen. I think that looks nice. I'm just wondering what caused this. If it was maybe just the whatever they used to print this on here, the paint absorbed the brown from the pen, or if I have this setting in a case with a glass top, and maybe the sunlight caused it to change color. I'm just curious if anybody else has had the same experience with their Golden Espresso. And finally, I've got a Jinhao X750. It has a 1.5 stub nib. And again, just like the swatch I did with the tweezers, I have trouble getting the ink to grab the paper. So again, I have to write with a heavy hand, which isn't the most pleasant writing experience. While this dries, I'm going to take a look at the writing sample on 20-pound copy paper. Writing on the copy paper, again, wasn't very pleasant. The wider nibs were okay. You can see it, the letters look a little ragged, but it wasn't unpleasant. It didn't feel dry. But the regular nibs, like the Metropolitan, felt too dry. The Grants felt too wet, and so I guess the letters don't look that bad, but it just felt too wet when I was writing. The ink was spreading, and it just wasn't pleasant. The 3776 was the only one that I felt tolerable, that I would be comfortable using if I had to on a regular basis. The Custom Heritage, again, was too wet. The letters just look too blobby. And the Extra Fine just felt too dry. And You can see, even though it's a pale ink, it came through the paper because it's just so watery. Now the swatch on my Tsubame ink collection card did a little bit better, but you can see it was crisp at the beginning, but it started losing connection with the paper toward the end. It's a nice color green. It looks almost like it has a little bit of gray in it. It's a sagey kind of green. And so I immediately thought of Diatramentis Jane Austen, which is a very similar green. Now this is looking a little more grassy green in my viewfinder. In real life, it's a little more sagey colored, but much more saturated. I'm a big fan of this ink. Diatramentis, anytime they have these inks that are named after literary or historical characters, it's just a rebranding of one of their regular inks, and it says on the bottle what ink it corresponds to, and I'll look it up again and I'll put it on the screen. Another sagey green that I'm really fond of is the Jacquardin Vert Atlantide, which has a little bit of silver and gold shimmer in it. It gives it the shimmer has kind of a champagne glitter to it, but again, it's much more saturated, and this flows out of the nib very nicely. I find out of the Jacquardin shimmer inks that I've tried, they flow very well in the pen, and the shimmer is really small, so it doesn't tend to clog up the pen. Another sagey ink from my collection that's even darker still is Colorverse Interstellar Space, but this came in one of the 4-packs of inks. It was a limited edition. It was pretty expensive. I think it was like $50 for 4 15-milliliter bottles. So I've still seen some available out there, but it's a similar kind of green, just much more saturated. And you can see it's a pretty wet ink. And finally, one of my favorite greens of all time, but with the most boring name, Diamine Green Black. It's just a very good performing, sagey, dark green. Very different from Kyo-no-oto Urahairo. Urahairo is not water resistant, but there was a surprising amount of blue left behind, just not enough to be able to comfortably read. Okay, the writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper. Very little show through with it being such a pale ink. Nothing even coming close to bleeding through. I have to say, overall, my favorite pen to use this with was the Kaweco Broad, and I tested it on the paper that I use for letter writing, and it was very comfortable and looked nice. I can see using this for letter writing. It's just kind of disappointing that it doesn't perform better in a wider range of nibs. I don't know if I mentioned earlier, but I started this writing sample, and when I saw how unpleasant this ink was in most of my favorite pens, I just really drug my feet completing this video. I really prefer inks that perform pretty well in a wide variety of nibs, and I should know this by now. These low saturation inks tend to disappoint me, but there are a few out there that have surprised me and are enjoyable to write with, so I do keep trying them. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.